This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hello and welcome to Thank You Mama. My name is Anna Teider. My guest today is Wendy Smith. Wendy is a professor of business administration at the University of Delaware. She teaches leadership, organizational behavior, and business ethics. She's the co-founder of the Learners Women's Leadership Initiative. And Wendy's work focuses on strategic paradoxes. We're going to learn more about it very soon. Wendy is the co-author of Both and Thinking, a book she wrote together with Marianne Lewis, which just came out this August, and I can highly, highly recommend it. We just spoke about it, Wendy and me. It might look a little scary at the first sight because it looks like it's written for managers, but it's beautifully accessible and very, very inspiring. I found it very inspiring. Wendy, hi and welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm very excited about this. Do you want to tell me a little bit about you and your work in the book?
Well, Anna, thank you for introducing the book as accessible. That was our goal. So I am an academic, as you said. I have a PhD, and I've been studying this idea of paradox and both and thinking along with my colleague Marianne Lewis for the past 25 years together. And we wrote this book to be able to translate, to take the ideas that we have been working on in our research and in our academic world and share it more broadly, because we do think that this notion of living in the and, both and, embracing paradox is a really important one in the world, given the kinds of challenges and complexity that we all face in our world today, in our personal lives and in our organizational lives.
Do you mind if I read a short sentence from the foreword? I think it beautifully describes why the book is so important right now. It says, opportunities to shift from either or thinking to both and thinking have never been more present than they are today in our increasingly complex, uncertain, and tenuous world. I so agree with this, and I think the timing is perfect for this book. We are all a little bit confused. Things are changing so quickly, and I really believe that the only thing that can save us right now is start the both and thinking.
Well, we agree with you. We definitely agree with that idea. And just, very briefly to ground this idea, what we all experience tensions and tug of wars and challenges. And again, that can be as simple as, what do I eat for breakfast? Or how do I navigate work-life balance? Or how do I make career decisions? To how do I lead in my company? To how do we deal with some of the really complex issues of racial injustice or climate change in the world that we face? And we often, our go-to is to think about those as either ors, as trade-offs, as dilemmas, as we have to choose one or the other. And so the key idea in this book is to help us shift to both and not only shift to both and, to reframe the questions so that we can accommodate both work and life, and we can both think about the short term and the long term, and we can both think about our own personal needs and the collective needs or the needs of others. And it's reframe that, but it's to take what has been a really robust community of scholars and research and say, how do we do it? How do we not just label this as a both and, but really what do we need to do to dig in and make that work, to overcome the conflicts and the polarization and the either or thinking to really make both anding work?
What I found very interesting is that you took us through a little history of paradox theories, and I read that we started thinking about it in 5th century BC in China and ancient Greece. It's definitely not a new concept, but we forgot it somehow on the way.
Yeah, often Marianne and I are credited for bringing both and paradox, or this particularly the idea of paradox, to the organizational research. And we see ourselves as standing on the shoulders of giants. And in fact, I'll give you a little insight here. in the book, we talk very briefly about the history of paradox. We had a whole chapter in the book that explored that history in depth. And that was the one chapter that got nixed, that got canceled because it was academic. So one day we'll write that chapter in depth because we think it's a fascinating history. And what we think is so fascinating about it is that this, as you said, this notion of paradox is something that the Buddha talked about, is something that is taught, that Lao Tzu and Confucius, that we talked about in Eastern philosophy 2,500 years ago, and we see in Western philosophy 2,500 years ago in Heraclitus. And by the way, as my colleagues will remind me, it's not just East and West. We see this in Southern and African philosophy and in Butsu, that I am me through my relationship with you. There's not just me versus you, or this boundedness of me and you. It's through you, I am me. And so we do see it 2,500 years ago. And fascinatingly, what we track is how this idea of moving from a linear either or perspective emerged in physics. And now quantum physics is very much about this paradoxical relationship. Is something exist or not exist? Well, it's both at the same time. Is it a stock or a flow? We see it in psychoanalysis. So people like Jung and Jungian philosophy and Viktor Frankl and Adler, they all talk about these shadow selves and the ways in which we both at the same time are expansive and restrictive, are extroverted and introverted, our self and our shadow selves, our conscious and our subconscious. So we see it all over the place. And really in the last 20 years, we have had colleagues in organizational theory say, you know what? We have to see this more in our social lives, in our organizational lives, not just as these philosophical paradoxes or these paradoxes in psychology or these paradoxes in psychoanalysis or physics, but we really have to see this in our social lives. And that's the work that we have been doing, which is to help us figure out how to see this in our everyday lives.
And I keep thinking, when I was reading the book, I kept thinking of women. I think this is a very, very, very modern woman's topic, because since our grandmothers started going to university and working, we are standing in front of this paradox or this dilemma of how much career and how much family. And I really spoke to so many women in the meantime for this podcast. It's still a dilemma. It's still a paradox. We still haven't really solved it.
Marianne and I talk a lot about this. I'm so glad you've pointed this out. So I lead a women's leadership initiative at the University of Delaware. Marianne is a dean and has been involved in women's leadership. We recently had a podcast where we brought on 4 amazing female leaders to talk about the paradoxes of women's leadership. And a huge one is indeed the work-life balance tension that we feel. And but there's more. There are others beyond that. How do we navigate as female leaders being both seen as competent and assertive and effective, and at the same time draw on what tends to be a female trait of being compassionate and kind and engaging? And oftentimes people will say, well, as soon as you're kind, you're no longer seen as competent. Well, how can we get beyond that as a trade-off, as a dilemma where we have to choose one or the other, and see the ways that compassion can enable our competence rather than take away from it? How our work can enable the rest of our lives and live in that ongoing balancing between work and life, rather than see this as this ongoing trade-off where we feel where each takes away from the other. How can they energize each other rather than diminish each other?
But you see, I always felt like both and thinking is a more female trait. I would call it a female way of thinking. And this is something that we still have not, or we're just starting, obviously, to explore with female leaders and managers. And I'm still missing, and I'm hoping it's coming, this female way of thinking, which I believe is more unifying and more both ends than the male way of thinking and functioning and leading that we had for past few centuries or millennia. I think it would really, really change the world. It's time.
I'll just tell you very briefly, we too hypothesized that women would be more effective at both anding. And there's some great research by our colleague Anita Woolley Williams, who's at Carnegie Mellon, and her colleagues, where they find that on teams, more females on teams allow the teams to be more collaborative, that we're going to move beyond the competitive nature of teams and see the ways in which we can interact. We, in our research, have not yet found a gender difference. And so along with our colleagues, Ella Marone-Spector at INSEAD and Amy Ingram at Clemson and Josh Keller at the University of New South Wales in Australia, we created what we call a paradox mindset inventory. And it assesses the extent to which we can engage paradoxically, the extent to which we see and experience tensions rather than hide them under the rug, and then are able to bring both and thinking to those tensions rather than either or. And we've distributed this across the world. We've translated it into Chinese and into Hebrew. We've probably thousands of people have taken this, and we have yet to identify that this is a approach that more women tend to do than men. And I'm not sure why, because we also hypothesized, as you did,
Interesting.
more women than men, but that has not borne out in the research yet. And so there's more research to come, and we welcome any hypotheses about why or what might be informing the gender difference or the lack of gender difference. But we are intrigued by that very question at a research level.
What I want to mention again is the chapter 6. The chapter 6, which to me felt a little bit, please don't get offended if I say it, I mean it in the most positive sense, a little bit self-helping. Because here you're talking about building a pause, about using emotions, about staying calm, about all of these things we need to embrace in order to deal with paradoxes. Because I so would like to see this book embraced as a self-help book, because I think we can all learn a lot from it. Can you give my listeners a tip? I know you wrote a whole book about it and it's not as simple, but how do we embrace the both and thinking? Where do we start?
Yes, well, we or I are not offended in the least. In fact, you are tapping into, by calling this a self-help book, in fact, so you're tapping into a core either or, I'll say it differently, a core dilemma that Marianne and I faced as we wrote the book, which is that we're academics. We want the book to be robust and filled with the research or informed by the research that we have been doing over the last 25 years. And the goal of writing this book was to translate that research or make it accessible and available broadly, because like you said, we are evangelists for both. And we do believe that in our complex world at the moment, there are these underlying paradoxical relationships. There's these tensions that both anding can really help. So we want the book to be available. So we are honored to call it self-help. We spent a lot of time thinking, how could we write a both and book that relies heavily on the research and yet makes it accessible to anybody that reads the book. And in fact, the very first story in the book is about my now 10-year-old son. He was 9 at the time. And he read the book because he loved how the book started out with a story about him. So we do hope that people will pick up the book and not feel alienated in the least, but really feel like they can access it. I'll just say very briefly that at the core of this book, to your question about how, the core of this book is the how. We start off by making the case why. Why is either or, as we say, limited at best and detrimental at worst? Why is it that we end up running amok or running into problems or what we call vicious cycles if we choose between alternatives and become committed to those choices? Why is that the case? Why does both and thinking enable us to be more creative? And then the bulk of the book really is how to do it. And, there's so much to say here. So I'll invite your readers to buy the book and to do a deeper dive. But I want to just say maybe two things, which is what you pointed out in chapter 6. One of the things we point to is the emotions that are necessary for navigating paradox and both and we highlight just how emotionally laden paradoxes can be. When we face conflict, we feel anxiety. We want to make a decision. We want that decision to be conclusive. We saw that so explicitly in the pandemic when there was so much uncertainty and we all grasp for certainty because we feel anxious or fearful with the uncertainty. Paradoxes raise this idea of living in competing ideas, and as soon as we pick a side about something, we want to defend that side and we reject the other side and we get defensive. So there's all of these important emotions. And I think it's critical, as you pointed out, that in order to navigate paradox, we have to be able to live into those emotions. And we are really clear. We call it finding comfort in the discomfort. We don't have to reject or negate those emotions or hide them, sweep them under the rug. But we need to honor and accept that these emotions, this discomfort, and be able to move forward amidst that, be able to accept the discomfort, accept the difficult emotions, honor them, and still be able to not let them drive our behaviors. So that's one. And I'll just say one other because, the other is changing our mindsets. And for us, the easiest or first way to change mindsets is to change the questions. So when we hear an either or question, should I do A or B? One advisor once told me the answer to should I do A or B is you should choose C, pick C. What we talk about is that in the face of either or questions, how can we change those questions to an and question, to how can I accommodate A and B, because changing the question opens up the possibility space.
Wendy, thank you so much for that. The book goes so much deeper into all of this, but thank you for sharing this quick overview. Before we go into talking about your mom, I wanted to come back quickly to you and ask you a little bit about yourself. When we know you're a mom, we heard that. A mom of how many?
Yes, I am a mom of 3 brilliant children. I have 16-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, and I have a 10-year-old, and they are fantastic.
Oh, you see? Both end.
Exactly. Well, I like to say both ending often comes up in raising twins, but it comes up in raising kids overall. So.
Just tell us quickly, how did it happen that you started researching paradoxes?
Yes. Well, part of what emerged was that I was studying organizational innovation. And I was studying how the top management team leaders of IBM were innovating, trying to develop what we now know as cloud computing, and at the same time hold on to their current customers and their current products and their current, millions and billions of dollar business. And how do they navigate that tension between today and tomorrow, their existing product, their innovation, short-term, long-term stability, change? And I was introduced to this idea of paradox through a class with the brilliant Richard Hackman, who writes about teams. He introduced it to me through this idea from a book, Paradoxes of Group Life by Wendy Smith and David Berg. And I looked around to say, who is writing about paradox in our field, and found Marianne Lewis, my colleague and co-author. She had just written a paper for our top journal that won the paper of the year and was one of the few articles of paradox in our field. And I called her up and said, I really just want to know everything that you know about this, because I think that these IBM leaders that I am talking with are experiencing and trying to navigate through paradox. Help me understand this. And so we met, and as we say, the rest is history. We've been working together.
Let's jump into talking about Mom Jewel Smith.
Yeah.
Tell me about her a little bit. Tell me about her story.
Well, and I love that you talk about Mom, because, I'll say they, both my parents, are behind everything that I do and don't get enough credit for it. And so certainly my mom and my dad, who was a professor and academic, but certainly my mom as well. And I'm so grateful to bring her into this work. My parents were both born in Montreal, Canada. They were born to immigrants, and Holocaust survivors in Canada. So they were first generation Canadian. And my mom grew up to first be a teacher, and that ethos of teaching is something that she passed on to me, and that also was something that was so part of how she interacts in amazing ways. She then, when we moved from Canada to the United States, and she knew that she was very good at organization. She was also very good at numbers, and she went into accounting and accounts receivable and bookkeeping. And truly, my mom was of a generation where career was something that she did, but not defining. So much of what I encounter as defining of my mom was the work that she did in community, in nonprofits, and in leadership. And she was always involved in community nonprofits. She was the president of a board for several years, but always involved in community organizing.
How many children did she have?
Yeah, there's two of us. Mm-hmm. So I have a sister a year older than me. And so there are just the two I won't say just, there are the two of us, powerful and fabulous.
Powerful and fabulous. I love it. Yes, is there a romantic story about how she met your dad?
They lived across the street from one another.
You see, there is a romantic story.
Yeah, they were neighbors. They didn't know each other so well. In fact, my dad's younger brother or middle brother was my mom's age, and my mom knew his brother much better. But they were neighbors across the street
when they were still kids, or very young, or.
I think the story is they moved in across the street from each other when they were teenagers, a little bit older. So not really, really young, but teenagers and a little bit older. Mm-hmm. And they have wonderful stories of how both my dad and his middle brother, my uncle, traveled Europe for 8 months. My mom and one of her best friends met up with them. They all traveled together for 3 months and decided to come back. And that's when they decided to come back. And my mom and dad decided to get married.
That's beautiful. European trip did it. Let's learn from her. I'm very curious to hear what are the most important lessons you learned from her.
And again, I want to say thank you for asking the question, because I think that just pausing to think about this, it was such a fabulous exercise for me to really define more specifically. So I'll start with the first one. I have 3. When I think of my mom, the first thing that I think about is the way in which she cultivated community, gathered friends and families, created opportunities for people to connect. Again, whether it was friends and families or broader communities. So we were the house where we were always hosting dinners, hosting parties. My friends would always hang out at our house. There was always food on the table of things to eat. She and my dad were hosting parties for their friends with great stories about New Year's parties, and just cultivating this sense of people coming together. As I said earlier, one of the things that I think about when I think of my mom is community organizing. She was very involved in nonprofits and in volunteer work, and involved in creating programming and organizing and bringing people together. And I think one of the lessons for me has been just how powerful it is to have really important people in your life, both personally and the power of friends and connections. It's also been, as I thought about it, something that has been a thread through my professional life. And when I think about it, I think I had mentioned earlier that this notion of paradox, when Marianne and I first started talking about it, there was only really a small handful of colleagues that we were engaged with that were speaking profoundly about paradox in our field. And a lot of people that were saying this was sort of a crazy idea and something that would never get published. And we persisted in continuing to publish around this. And what I would say is one of the things that I'm most proud about academically is not just the publications and the research and persisting. It was building a community of colleagues and scholars to support one another in these ideas. And we built that community through conferences. We built that community through workshops that we would put on, through newsletters, through social media. But there is really a fabulous community of scholars and academia is not always that supportive. It can be kind of cut. This is a really collaborative, supportive community. And it's something that I am proud of having to invested in and seeing the product of. And I think it comes right back to those dinners that my mom would host and always be available for anybody that walked into her house, and that community organizing she did.
I love that. I love that how you recognized it in your own life and career, how you translated it to us, to how it impacted you. Here's one thing I'm curious about. You keep on talking about her volunteer work and nonprofit. Did she have favorite topics?
A lot of it was more broad community organizing. A lot of it was through, so I mentioned that my parents, their parents were Holocaust survivors, were Jewish. A lot of it was through the Jewish community. She really did organize issues of Holocaust memorial and making sure that history was passed on. She organized around helping to advance kind of communal efforts. So a lot of it was really enmeshed in broadly the Jewish community and social justice around that broadly.
Let's hop on to the second lesson.
Right. So opportunities, not obstacles. In my head, my mom would often talk about seeing the glass as half full and not half empty. And to me, that would often be translated to that if something would go wrong, if there would be an issue, my mom wouldn't dwell on it. She would invite us to accept it and move forward and be able to see possibilities, not obstacles, or to move beyond the obstacles to see possibilities. And and I think that was true for her and her life, that if she was constantly looking for new opportunities of ways to engage with people and with things. And the one that I remember is actually her helping me think through this. And so, like I said, my mom was a community leader. I was involved in a youth group when I was a kid, and I got really involved with this youth group so that I ran for an international office when I was in my junior year of high school, and I lost, and I was devastated. And my mom truly helped me through that emotional difficulty, accepting it, acknowledging it, and asking and inviting what it looked like to move on. And actually moving on for me was that I went back to my local chapter of this organization, and I decided to run for and won being the local chapter president. It was the role that I loved most because it was the most hands-on opportunity to work with a chapter of 25 people together. We did a lot of community service and a lot of social justice work. And it turned out that, and I let go of the international level. It turned out, for a set of circumstances that just shifted in ways that I had not at all expected, I ended up going back to the international conference, running again the next year, becoming the international president of this organization. But I was not at all expecting that. And it was my mom who invited me to not dwell in the angst of the loss, but see the possibility of what it took to go forward. And I do hold that lesson. I think it's a hard one because I think it's easy to dwell in our limitations. I think it's important to acknowledge when things go wrong and to honor when we have feelings of frustration or jealousy or aggravation or, loss or grief. And I think it's also important to, at the same time, counter that, balance that. I guess it would be the paradoxes of emotions, the emotional ambivalence, as my colleague Naomi Rothman talks about, the need to also be able to see the possibilities. And my mom was great at helping with that.
Only a few of us have that naturally inbuilt. I think, as you said, it's very easy to just dwell in problems and losses. And very many of us just really have to be the ones who push us out of that consciously and say, move on.
Yes.
We really have to work on that. Many of us, I'm saying, because some people like your mom are just born with it, but I think many of us are not.
We have to be reminded again and
Yes,
again.
yes, we do.
Yeah.
And we had a
Yeah.
third one.
Yeah. So, I sort of put it as fun or passion. One of the things that I think about when I think about my mom was how she really crafted life to be full of fun activities for herself, for us as a family. I spoke a little bit about those kinds of community building or family activities. There was lots of picnics. I lived a mile from my dad's two brothers and their families, and every Sunday night was a family event, and that was filled with fun. But it was also there was always craft projects that we were doing and that she was leading us and getting us involved in. There was, she herself was doing fun things. My mom was involved in community theater for a number of years and on stage, and I can certainly get pretty enmeshed and excessive about my work. And I, often pause and think about my mom and the fun that she had. And really, those are the moments that I remember best as a child. Those are the moments that are so salient to me. And I'm inspired to pause and think about what that fun looks like for my kids. My mom would always, as the teacher in her, she would always make teaching fun. And there was always a moment where, in a conversation, she might bring up a math puzzle or a math problem, or, invite us to think about grammar or, words or vocabulary. I would watch her do the same with my kids. And so I'm always inspired to think about, well, what would it look like to just put down the pen or the computer or the work and go out and have a chat and a walk with friends and a coffee with friends, be able to have a hike with my kids, and really think through that those are the moments that we hold most precious. And it's sometimes the big moments, like she committed to acting in local theater, and it's sometimes just and often just those small moments of taking a pause and having a chance to connect and do things that were fun and memorable.
Wendy, what is your fun?
My fun is outdoors very often, hiking, running. I just ran my first, well, not my first 5K. I just ran a 5K with my 10-year-old son. That was his first 5K, our first 5K together, that we were both very proud of. I love being outdoors and hiking and walking with my dog outdoors or hiking mountains. I was just in LA and I was out there for 24 hours, but got a chance to do some hiking in the hills of LA.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And so, or reading. I'm not a big video, TV, movie person, but a good book will make me happy on any day.
Mm-hmm. You inspired us a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll say my mom inspired us.
Your mom
inspired.
Thank you, Jewel. You mentioned 3 lessons. I believe we have 3 lessons. Do you have anything else you'd like to share before I ask you my trick question? The trick question.
I just hope that my mom and her friends are listening and, they will resonate with just how great she is as a friend and as somebody who brings people together for sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let us talk about if there was anything important she was not able to teach you, anything you had to learn yourself.
Yeah, I think my mom and her generation grappled with, and you started us off in asking this question, but they grappled with the work-family balance in very different ways than I think I have grappled with in my life, and the ways that I see many of my friends grappling with. I think it was more clear in her relationship with my dad that even as my mom worked and had a really demanding time-wise job, that she was sort of the primary parent, that parenting first fell to her and my dad was the support parent. And I think that that's a lesson that we've shifted along the way, that those roles have shifted, that our generation, or many of us, not everybody, but those of us in this generation where there are 2 working parents, both of which with jobs just as demanding and both of which looking to take over the domestic role, have had to learn to negotiate and navigate in a very different way. There's a lot of both anding there. It can raise conflict, but that conflict can be really creative. And I think that's a space that I find that I am navigating that was a little more assumed of what those roles would be with my parents. And so I think that's something that that our generation, or I certainly am, finding a way around and looking for different kinds of mentors and different kinds of role models that have managed that space.
Wendy, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was super, super fun. Let's quickly recap. So, as lessons you learned from Mama Jewel, we have the community. And I wrote down how powerful it is to have people in your life. For me, this is the lesson.
Yes.
The second lesson was opportunities, not obstacles. So trying to see the glass of half full, acknowledging the problem or the challenge, but moving on. And then fun, just having fun in life, not forgetting to have fun in life. It's beautiful how you mentioned that when you look back, those fun moments are the moments you remember. So we really have to consciously think about this. What do our children remember one day? And then we talked about what she was not able to teach you. And I love it how you prefaced it with simply the generational differences. Their generation was just different in this. She was not able to teach you this because she didn't live it, which is how to navigate the work-family balance in a family in which, as you said, both partners have equally powerful, strong, demanding careers.
Yes. I wanted to add to that, sorry, because as you said that, it just was so resonant. And I'll just bring in for 2 seconds my mother-in-law, who wrote a Posner Proust, who also just fabulous and has been a huge source in our lives and our kids' lives, just as my mom. And she will often point out the extent to which her generation just they had different challenges when it came to gender, when it came to women, but often those roles were more assumed. And sometimes, as she'll point out to us, that's easier because you don't have to negotiate all those roles. And sometimes that's harder because it doesn't give us much opportunity for everybody to land where they will. And it's, my mother-in-law is often sharing that wisdom of the extent to which there are these generational differences about how we have navigated gender, family, career tensions and opportunities.
Wendy, thank you. Thank you again for saying yes and being my guest. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I was very excited that the book found me.
Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to bring my mom and all of her wisdom into these ideas. I really value that. So thank you.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyoumama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.